Welcome back to Quick Tips from the C-Suite. I'm Travis Thomas, and over the past 25 years, I've had the privilege of sitting across from CEOs, founders, board members, investors, and executive leaders during some of the most defining moments of their careers. Most people assume the greatest challenges of leadership are strategic, capital, competition, growth, execution. But after thousands of conversations, I've come to believe the greatest challenges are rarely found on an organizational chart or even a balance sheet. They're carried quietly within that leader. Today's conversation, it isn't about strategy. It's about something far more personal. It's the hidden weight of being the person everyone depends on. Because while organizations often celebrate leadership, very few people ever stop to ask what leadership actually costs. And perhaps the greatest burden isn't making the difficult decisions. Perhaps it's believing you have to carry them alone. Let's get started. As I reflected on that conversation, I realized something I'd somehow missed for years. The CEO wasn't struggling because he lacked capability. He wasn't overwhelmed because he lacked intelligence, and he certainly wasn't questioning his commitment. He was carrying something much heavier: expectation. The expectation to be certain, the expectation to remain composed, the expectation to reassure everyone else, even when he wasn't sure himself. The higher a leader rises, the less permission they often feel to be fully human. Somewhere along the journey, many leaders began revealing and believing they have to project confidence at all times. And that uncertainty is weakness. That asking for help somehow diminishes their credibility, so they carry it quietly, meeting after meeting, decision after decision, year after year. Not because anyone asked them to, because somewhere along the way, they convinced themselves that leadership required it. I've now seen this pattern hundreds of times. The titles change, the industries change, the companies change, but the burden remains remarkably consistent. Leaders who feel they must protect everyone else while quietly carrying everything themselves. And here's what I've come to believe: the weight isn't what exhausts great leaders, isolation does. Because the moment a leader believes they have no place to tell the truth, they begin to carry two burdens: the responsibility of leadership and the loneliness of protecting an image. That second burden is almost always the heavier one, and almost no one ever sees it. That conversation, that exact conversation, forced me to confront something I had never fully considered. Somewhere along the journey, many leaders begin believing they have to become something they were never meant to be. Certain, always certain, certain in front of the board, certain with their executive team, certain with investors, certain with employees, certain with their families. And if leadership requires the absence of uncertainty, But that's never been my experience. In fact, after thousands of conversations with extraordinary leaders, I've discovered something remarkably different. The best leaders I've ever met weren't defined by certainty. They were defined by curiosity. They asked better questions. They invited different perspectives. They challenged their own assumptions. And they weren't afraid to say, I don't know. Not because they lacked confidence, because they possessed something far more valuable: humility. I've often wondered if we've unintentionally taught leaders the wrong lesson. We celebrate decisiveness, but rarely celebrate reflection. We reward confidence, but seldom reward curiosity. We admire certainty, even though certainty has been the beginning of countless poor decisions. Perhaps the strongest leader in the room isn't the one with the quickest answer. Perhaps it's the one creating enough safety for everyone else to tell the truth. Because organizations don't fail when leaders admit they don't know. Organizations fail when leaders pretend they do. And that distinction has stayed with me ever since. And I can honestly say I've never lost respect for a leader who admitted uncertainty. I've only lost trust in those who hid behind certainty. I've thought about the CEO's word many times over the years. I don't know who I can tell the truth to anymore. And for a long time, I believed his greatest burden was leadership. I don't believe that anymore. I think his greatest burden was the identity he believed leadership required. Think about that. Somewhere along the journey, many leaders stop allowing themselves to be human. They become the title, the CEO, the founder, the president, the visionary, the one with all the answers, the one who can't afford to doubt, the one who always has to be strong. And without realizing it, they slowly disappear behind the role they've been entrusted to serve. I've watched remarkable leaders become imprisoned by the very identity that made them successful. Not because anyone demanded it, because they quietly demanded it of themselves. And here's the paradox: the moment we begin protecting an identity, we stop protecting the truth. We edit ourselves, we filter our questions, we suppress uncertainty, we perform confidence. Not because we're trying to deceive others, but because we're afraid of disappointing the image we've created. And that's absolutely exhausting. And eventually, it becomes lonely. Not because no one is willing to walk beside us, because we've convinced ourselves they can only walk beside the title, not the person. And the most extraordinary leaders I've ever known all seem to discover the same quiet truth. Leadership was never asking them to become invincible. It was inviting them to become authentic, to exchange performance for presence, to replace certainty with curiosity, to stop carrying an image and start carrying the truth. Because here's what I've learned after 25 years of sitting in rooms where billion dollar decisions are made. People don't trust leaders because they're perfect. They trust leaders because they're real. The strongest leader in the room is rarely the one pretending to have all the answers. It's the one courageous enough to create a room where the truth no longer needs permission to be spoken. And perhaps that's the real weight no one sees. Not the responsibility of leadership, the quiet belief that we must stop being human in order to deserve it. I've often wondered what became of that CEO, not the company, the man. Because in many ways, his story became a mirror for my own. And over the years, I've realized something I wish I had understood much earlier. The people we lead aren't asking us to be fearless. They aren't asking us to be perfect. And they certainly aren't asking us to carry every burden alone. They're asking us for something much simpler: to be present, to be honest, and to be fully there. I've sat in boardrooms where the smartest person at the table changed almost no one. And I've sat with leaders whose calm presence transformed an entire organization before they spoke a single word. That's when I began to understand something I'd never been taught. Leadership is less about managing people and more about managing our presence, because presence creates safety, safety creates honesty, and honesty creates clarity, and clarity creates better decisions. Everything begins there. I've watched organizations spend millions of dollars trying to solve problems that were never operational. They were relational, not because the strategy was flawed, but because people no longer felt safe enough to tell the truth. And when the truth arrives late, organizations pay interest on decisions that they could have been avoided. Perhaps that's why I've come to believe the greatest responsibility of leadership isn't carrying the weight of an organization. It's creating an environment where no one else has to carry theirs alone. Because extraordinary leaders don't simply produce results, they produce relationships where people can think clearly, speak honestly, and become more fully themselves. And when that happens, something remarkable occurs. The leader is no longer carrying the organization. The organization begins carrying one another. And maybe, just maybe, that's what leadership was always meant to be. Not one extraordinary person holding everything together, but one courageous person creating the conditions where everyone rises together. I'm going to repeat that. Write this one down. And maybe that's what leadership was always meant to be. Not one extraordinary person holding everything together, but one courageous person creating the condition where everyone rises together. I've come to believe that leadership asks something of us that no title can ever prepare us for. Not more intelligence, not more resilience, not even more courage. It asks us to remain human while carrying responsibilities that often tempt us to become something else. And over the years, I've watched extraordinary leaders build remarkable organizations. But the ones I'll never forget weren't remembered because they always had the right answer. They were remembered because people felt different in their presence. They felt safer. They felt seen. They felt valued. They felt heard. And perhaps that's the true measure of leadership. Not what we build, but what becomes possible because we were there. The CEO I spoke with that day gave me a gift he probably never realized he was giving. He reminded me that even those entrusted with carrying the greatest responsibility still need a place where they don't have to carry it alone. And maybe that's true for all of us. Perhaps leadership was never meant to be a lonely journey. Perhaps we've simply confused strength with silence. So before we meet again, I'd leave you with one question. Who knows the real you behind the title? Because the quality of that answer may quietly shape the quality of your leadership. Thank you for joining me today. And until next time, lead with courage, listen with presence, and remember the strongest leaders aren't the ones who carry the most. They're the ones who create the conditions where no one has to carry it alone.